One is, what do you hope for in San Antonio? Right? So that's the first question. And the second question is really more about, what do you mourn for in San Antonio? I mean, we're in a very interesting time. And so let's just take about 30 seconds to really think about that question. And we're actually going to come back to these. So I'm going to do a countdown, and I want us to be reflective and just take a few seconds or so to really think about those two questions. Okay, awesome. So definitely hold on to those. If you've written them down, that's great. If you shared them in the chat, that's awesome. We're going to come back to that. And so now what we're going to do is, I want to turn this over to Christine. And before I do that, I want to just let you guys know that we were really very excited about connecting with Christine and the work that she's done in this city. Christine, I just want to have everyone kind of get to know you. Some of these folks know of your work and they know what you've done, and some don't. And I thought it'd be great and kind of interesting for you to just share a little bit about your own personal story, how you came into this city, and what really interested you about the city and the work that you've done.
Thanks, Zachary, and hello. And I'm just thrilled that so many people are here, and thanks for giving us your time. And actually, that's a really easy and maybe not that interesting answer to your question, because I don't think I'm unique in my story in any way. Like everybody else's story, me entering in this city had everything to do with my kids. I was offered this job at Trinity in 2002. I was up in the DC area. I was really excited when I got the job because I had done graduate school in Austin, like so many of us. My husband is from way West Texas and really wanted to get back. And so we began to search for a house. And from the DC area, we talked to several realtors, and they asked me questions, and they asked about my family, and they asked about my profession, and they listened obviously to my voice, and they profiled me. And they basically said where I wanted to live and where I didn't. And I insisted, no, I really, I was coming here to teach urban studies. I'm from cities. I want to live in the inner city. And they basically said, no, you don't. Or if you do, you can't send your kids to school, right? Your kids will have to go to Keystone, someone said. And I looked up Keystone, and Keystone was more than my salary. So I couldn't send my kids to Keystone. And they said I couldn't send my kids to neighborhood schools. And I began hearing about school districts, right? You can go to that one, but you can't go to that one, and don't even think about that one, and you don't even drive through that one. And it's like, what is with the school districts? School districts we make up, they're political boundaries. We made them up. Why do we worship them so? Why do we organize ourselves around them so? So that experience became a passion for me. And, long story short, we bought a house in SAISD. Kids went to school. Kids are now functioning adults, and they're doing fine, right? So that's where the work that I've done now for almost 20 years, that's where it started, is like in a deep personal experience and just trying to navigate what's kind of a complicated political geography. But so that's me, right? But the way that we really want to kick off today is not even in San Antonio. And Jessica, if you could play that short video clip of Minneapolis, and then we'll talk about San Antonio.
In the fall of 1909, W.H. Simpson and his wife Daisy purchased a lot in the Prospect Park neighborhood of Minneapolis. They would be the second black family to move into the neighborhood. But before they could even begin construction on their new home, they were confronted by a white mob. The mob spokesperson told the family in no uncertain terms that their new neighbors would take any means necessary to secure the Simpsons' removal. This confrontation, which the Minneapolis Tribune referred to as a race war, failed to terrorize the Simpsons into submission. They did continue to live in the neighborhood. But it did mark a turning point in the history of Minneapolis. You see, Minneapolis, like many northern cities actually, wasn't always segregated. And this may come as a surprise to some of you, but in the early 20th century, the city of Lakes was actually a fairly integrated place. In 1910, the part of the city with the highest percentage of black residents, it's near North Minneapolis, and it's only about 15% African American. And in addition, there are actually emerging integrated communities in places like the south shores of Lake Harriet, around Lake Nokomis, along the Mississippi River corridor, and sprinkled throughout northeast Minneapolis. But by mid-century, this picture looks radically different. Those black families down by Lake Harriet and Lake Nokomis, all gone. Same story with the black families who were living along the Mississippi River. In fact, by 1940, there is no census district in northeast Minneapolis containing multiple black families. And it's important to note that during this period, the overall number of African Americans is actually staying fairly consistent. In 1910, 1% of the city is black. By 1950, it's increased, but only slightly, to 1.5%. So this concentration that you see, and if you look at this 1940 map, you'll see we actually have majority-minority neighborhoods by 1940. This concentration is not the result of an influx of new African Americans into the city. Rather, this is the result of taking an existing integrated city and forcing African American families out of these integrated neighborhoods and concentrating them into small pockets of Minneapolis. Minneapolis simply was not always segregated. And when the Simpsons moved into the Prospect Park neighborhood, they had no idea of knowing that the city was on the cusp of a massive racial reordering. In the early 20th century, racist ideas are beginning to be deployed in new ways. And this notion that the quality of a neighborhood depends on the racial category of that neighborhood's occupants, this idea begins to spread like wildfire throughout the country. It's embraced by virtually all white people. White homeowners, politicians, bankers, real estate developers, you name it. They came up with all kinds of new ways to inscribe this racist idea into the built environment. To put it simply, racial residential segregation was becoming the new normal. And this profoundly altered the urban landscape.
Christine, you're muted.
We know how this ends. This ends with the murder of George Floyd this summer, the protests that it sparked across the entire country that continue, right? And so now let's take this and let's take it to San Antonio and try to understand our own story, because Minneapolis is not unique. And the geography of San Antonio's inequality crisis, as I prepared for this talk over the last couple of weeks, and I looked at the title, I realized that the title wasn't conveying really what I wanted it to. When we say the geography of something, we imply that we're going to map things, which we are. But when I say the geography in something, I mean that the geography is actually a part of it. It's really within the inequality. And that really conveys my essence a little bit better. But this is the San Antonio that everybody thinks about. This is the San Antonio on our postcards. This is the San Antonio that people from the outside know about us. But you and I also know that this is San Antonio. This was San Antonio on April 11th of this year. San Antonians without food due to the coronavirus. And like Minneapolis, we know how this story ends, right? It ends on May 11th and it ends with COVID. COVID has made it very clear that while we love this city, and it's a beautiful city, we hide our inequalities. We're a segregated city. We fail to see, or perhaps are not even aware of some of our inequalities. So my challenge over the next several years has been to make us aware, and not in a blame way, but in a methodical research way, in order to understand the past so we can do something about it in the future. We're a beautiful city. We have wealth and we have poverty. And they're not that far away from one another, but they're hidden All cities have inequalities. They have wealth and they have poverty, but this is our city. And we want it to be the very best city in the world. In fact, there's many San Antonios, right? All cities have contrasts, but ours are very stark. And because we're segregated, so many of us are not even really aware of the other until we're on the news. I can map it, right? Our neighborhoods differ, and that difference encodes our inequality. Our income levels differ by neighborhood. Our lifespan differs by neighborhood. In our inner city neighborhoods, the average lifespan is 70 years old. In our neighborhoods on the edge of the city, the lifespan is 88. It's an entire generation that some people get to live longer than others, and that's inequality. So I'm interested in this, right? I'm particularly interested in this distribution, right, of incomes, of health outcomes, not just on a spectrum, but geographically, because we're separated from one another. And how did this come to be? We're aware, the media keeps us aware, and I think that they do a good job, but we're not aware from personal experience. We often don't experience one another's lives. Right? Until it becomes national news like it did on the 11th. And now COVID has brought it to our attention again. So I really have a couple of questions, right? In our lunch hour. And my questions are these. How did it happen? How did it come to be? As in Minneapolis, lots of cities are asking this question. But my second question is, what can we do about it? And both questions are necessary. We can't skip one. Politicians and community workers tend to skip the first and run right to the second. What do we do? We know the statistics, so what do we do to fix it? Academics like myself tend to go to the first and don't pay attention to the second. Feel that we don't need to get involved in that, and it's completely untrue. We need each other desperately in order to understand what's happening today in our city. I'm going to complicate this just slightly, because I don't want to talk about incomes and income inequality. I want to talk about wealth. So I'm going to switch the conversation up a little bit. Wealth is all of our assets minus our liabilities. Wealth is really an indication of the long term and long-term change. Wealth and income are like climate and weather. Climate is the overall and weather is the day-to-day, right? Incomes vary, but it's wealth that allows us to think about the future. And in America, in the United States, the way that we've written the laws and institutions, the place that we hold our wealth is in our home. 42% of household wealth in the United States is held in our homes. 28% is held in retirement accounts, but that's really kind of a middle-class white thing. A lot of people, I think it's about 70% of Americans still don't have a retirement accounts and are overly dependent on Social Security. In San Antonio, about 62% of whites own their own home. These statistics are from the last census. In 2010, those houses were worth about 150, probably now about 250. So just think of these as relative terms. 33.8 or about 34% of African Americans own their homes, and they were worth $115,000. And about 54% of Latinos own their homes, and they're worth $91,000. This is wealth. This is a reflection of wealth, right? So how did it happen? How did this odd distribution of wealth come to be? And we could even call it segregated. We're segregated by our wealth. And this is an old story. So we need to be patient with me for a couple of minutes while I take us back, because it's encoded in our history, right? It starts with the the buildup of the city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, really when we put in our first neighborhoods. And it's a process just like what happens today. When somebody buys up a piece of property at the edge of town that was ranch land or agricultural, they go down to the Bexar County Courthouse. They say, I want to develop this property. They plat it, right? They negotiate on what fees to pay and who's going to put in the streets and the infrastructure. The same thing in 1900. And this is a map from really, it's a late 1800s, 1890s map. And on it, I've put the neighborhoods as they develop, right? And this is just through title searches. So all the little red squares are neighborhoods that are getting developed in the early parts of the 20th century. For this presentation, I really want to focus in on one. So I don't want to remain at the level of the city. We're going to focus in on the Near East Side so that we can feel this. Just like I said, we rarely get the opportunity to feel it. We read about it, but not feel it. So I'm going to showcase Dignity Hill. And I saw that somebody was from Dignity Hill. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. And Dignity Hill is on our very Near East Side. I've coded here in green 2 lovely little parks that are right in the middle of the neighborhood. The blue is a community center and a school. It's called San Antonio's first suburb. The very elite of San Antonio moved in the late 1800s to this area of town to escape the inner city chaos, right? It's dirty, it's loud, there's animals in the streets. And the elite move. Then they start to move into King William, but they also moved to this area on the east side. And they built these beautiful houses up on the hill overlooking the city. It's a beautiful neighborhood. It's actually rapidly gentrifying today. And these houses are right on those little parks. Behind these houses, an entire neighborhood was built. The houses themselves were built by the elite one by one, but then a developer built an entire neighborhood right behind it. And it's also called Dignity Hill. And this is the original plat for that neighborhood, and built these beautiful houses, right? Houses that were built in the early 20th century. And the process of wealth accumulation begins for these families. And like any house that we buy, like a house that you and I buy today, it comes with legal documentation, right? It comes with a lot of legal documentation that says what you can and can't do with this house, how you're going to pay it back, where's all the filing and all of these things. And it also comes with some restrictions. And so housing at this time came with restrictions, but it comes with restrictions today. So houses like this, for example, and I've highlighted this, but I know that it's difficult to read. You couldn't run a clinic for those with infectious disease, and they're very worried about TB at the time. You couldn't have an open air structure like a barn for living purposes. Right? You couldn't really have a barn even for animals in your backyard, although we know we have chickens. You couldn't run a hotel out of your house. It's all fine, right? Another, as a covenant, and I'm reading at this point, as a covenant running through the land is expressly understood and agreed that any sale or lease of said premises or any portion thereof to any Mexican or any person of Negro descent shall immediately cause the title hereto to revert to this grantor. And then a sentence later, it says, no house, no dwelling erected in this neighborhood shall cost less than $5,000. And we laugh at $5,000, but today this $5,000 for a house then would be $400,000 for a house today. So what are we doing when we use legal instrumentation like this and like this? Is we're sorting ourselves spatially, but we're also racializing wealth. Who's going to be able to accumulate wealth through home ownership is those who are going to be allowed into these neighborhoods where housing is worth this much, right? And we have racialized, in this process, we're racializing wealth as we sort our population. This is a little page from the 1940 census, just to give you some insights into how some of this work is done. The 1940 census has been released at the household level, so I can go from house to house to find out who lived there, right? And so this is on Milam and North Hackberry in the little neighborhood on the east side. And it tells me their names, it tells me if they rent or they own, it tells me their race or their ethnicity. And so I can plot and I map this, right? And this is horribly incomplete, but it's telling me, I've used the kind of pasty white color for the white families and then the purple and the green for African American and Mexican American families. And looking along the park, right? I told you about the park where the elite settled so they could see over the city. Those were white families. And the neighborhood right behind the park that was deed restricted, those were also white families. But look up towards the railroad, up toward the railroad tracks. We have white families, we have Mexican American families, we have African American families. And the plots of land are smaller. This is an integrated part of the neighborhood, right? Like Minneapolis, San Antonio was not always segregated. It's horribly unequal, yes, but not segregated at this point, right? And those houses, I showed you the others. These are the little houses that are up along the railroad tracks. These were never deed restricted. These were open to everyone, but they're small, they're humble, and they're on smaller pieces of property. So this is the wealth that someone else is going to be able to accumulate. This was an integrated neighborhood, racially and ethnically integrated, but horribly unequal. By mid-century, right, it's in these neighborhoods, the residents of San Antonio really emerged from the Great Depression. And following the Great Depression with a New Deal, we enter a new phase of city building and city development. But this phase is risk averse. Right? We're pulling out of the Great Depression and banks are unwilling to lend because of the Great Depression. But then the federal government gets involved and literally rewrote the mortgage guidelines. And they invent new mortgage products. The FHA mortgage, for example. Many of us have had one of these or have one. A 30-year mortgage, amortizing mortgage with very little money down. This creates home ownership and the middle class in the United States. But these banks were very worried about risk. They were risk averse. And risk in real estate was associated with mixed race and non-white neighborhoods. And so they began to map, right? The United States government, these are federal maps. They mapped race and ethnicity. This is the federal government that's coming into every city in the country and doing this. And then they map risk and they color coded it. And this is our redlining map. Risk is tied to race and more precisely to the presence of non-whites in an area. Remember that the previous era of city building and development, we'd also used legal tools such as racial restrictions to sort out our population. But now the federal government is coming along and getting involved also. And they color coded our neighborhoods. Green and blue on this map were an indication to banks that this area had sound housing, homogeneously white populations, and had very low risk. Feel free to lend money or lend capital in those neighborhoods. Yellow and especially red coded areas on the map held housing that had possibly begun to deteriorate, and or, not necessarily both, a non-homogeneous population, mixed race or non-white. So our beautiful housing, right? The beautiful housing that I showed you around town, around Trinity, near where I work right now, this is green lined, right? Capital continued to flow through the entire 20th century. If this household needed to borrow against their house or wanted to buy or to sell, they could do so with a pretty low interest loan. Our yellow areas also had deteriorated, and now we're starting to bring them back. And you see a lot of activity in our yellow coded areas around town today of people really starting to reinvest in some of this, in some of this, these houses in these neighborhoods. But we've also got our small houses, the small, humble houses, where communities had been more integrated or were non-white. These are our redlined areas. Right? These are our redlined areas. If I zoom back in, right, I said that I wanted to focus in on one part of town. Let's zoom back into the Near East Side, right? And the entire thing, right, the entire neighborhood of Dignity Hill is redlined. We had the elite living on the park. We had the white, heavily restricted neighborhood behind the park, and we had the racially integrated yet humble neighborhood along the railroad tracks. The entire thing gets redlined, and in that process is denied investment capital, mostly through the 20th century. Everybody's lumped together, right? And it's not because of the housing; it's because it was perceived as mixed race. So this is redlined, right? The beautiful elite houses are redlined. The racially restricted houses behind it were redlined. And then the little houses up along the railroad tracks, the humble housing is also redlined. So the housing, all of it was, but also please notice the infrastructure here, right? Look at the street. The street, the lack of drainage, there's no curbs, there's no driveway. Well, there's probably no driveway because the house is old enough not to have a driveway. Street light, those street poles, the street lighting was just gone in recently. So not only did the banks pull investment dollars out of our inner city neighborhoods, so too does the city. Right? So the city's following some of those indicators that are coming from the banks. It's in this time period, right, mid 20th century, that our city starts to grow and continues to grow. Right? We begin to annex, we develop, and we develop more along the edges of the city up through the 1960s. And these neighborhoods are our middle class neighborhoods. Our growth, our mid-century growth, was at a time when mortgages were still restricted. If you're non-white, it's very difficult to get a mortgage, and if you do, it's going to be probably at a higher interest rate. So white families had tools. They had the tools necessary to leave those inner city neighborhoods that were being divested and move into these newly developed suburban neighborhoods, which are much more difficult for non-white families to move into. And this is our middle class, right? And those families who lived in the older neighborhoods, they moved out and they moved into our middle class suburban neighborhoods. And they continue to house our middle class. Meanwhile, let's go back to the East Side. What's happening? We're redlined in the 1930s and 1940s, and with that, housing begins to deteriorate. And what I've done on this map is, if you notice the gray squares are industrial creep. So industry is starting to come into this neighborhood, and notice where most of it is, right? It's along the railroad tracks where the small and humble and integrated housing once was, right? So one of the questions with this is, there was a lot of people that lived there. Hundreds and hundreds of people lived in that area that's really now been taken over by industry. And where do they go? And the chances are they went deeper into the neighborhood because the white families had left. Housing was sold, or more likely, a lot of that housing passed into rentals. So the old neighborhood that I told you about is now in rentals. Houses are subdivided, and a lot of these families that are displaced through industrial creep are pushed into some of the rentals that are a little bit deeper in. All of this stuff, all of these legal tools that I've been telling you about are really erased with the Johnson administration and the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. He removes all racist language from federal housing documentation and practices, although it does continue in de facto practices. But by 1960s, right, we've become aware, and we call it the age of equality and the age of Aquarius. And we sing songs, right? And we have musicals, and we do deeply believe that all are equal, and we have to treat everyone equally. And how do we do this, right? We start to come up with standards, and we insist from the highest levels of government down to the local levels that all of us are equal. And how do we do this? In education. Right, the Robin Hood laws came out of this era that says we need to have equal funding for students across all of Texas. And this is not just Texas, this is in a lot of states. And we pass a series of different legislation in order to assure that, right? Locally, local political representation, right? We went to single member districts in 1977 with city council. Local public investment, rough proportionality amongst council districts of the city council budget. And even at the federal level, in federal housing policy and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, to make sure that mortgage money is getting into different parts of town. Right? So we're aware of inequality in the 1960s, 1970s. But here's my question. When we start with inequality, tremendous inequality that we've created through legal instruments and policy, and then we treat everyone as equals, what do we produce? Right? We just reproduce the status quo. That's all we've done. And and again, I'm going to map it because I map everything, right? 1960 census. This is income, and I code income quantities with color. So the light colors are very low income, and the darker colors are higher income. And we can see from 1960, 1980 up until nearly today that my inner city neighborhoods that had been redlined in the 1930s continue to be my poorer neighborhoods today. when we insisted on equality without really confronting the challenge of inequality, we reproduced it. And now, so what's happening now, right, in 2020? Because neighborhoods continue to change, right? And let's return. And in our inner city, we know that families struggle. They're struggling to maintain their homes, and this could get much worse as we've seen unemployment figures go way up, especially among particular portions of our population. And back on the east side's changing, right? Back to the east side. It had been integrated, then it had been denied investment, then industrialized, then deindustrialized, and now it's getting built up again. But my question is, for whom? When redlining policies were removed around 1970, this neighborhood, right, of distinctive beauty, of the elite houses and those restricted houses that were so well built and so beautiful, they were exposed. It was old housing. At this point now, it's old housing. It's deteriorated, but it could be brought back. Right? It was a neighborhood with abandoned industrial buildings that could be demolished and replaced with housing. And now it's being gentrified. Right? The old deteriorated housing was bought, reinvested in, and increased substantially in value. And now new construction is going in. But the average, and that's the blue squares on my map, the average value of the new construction is $348,000. So while this was an integrated yet unequal neighborhood, now it's going to be a little less integrated, but it's going to be for the elite, and those with lower incomes are going to be pushed. So is this what we want for our city, right? As we start to wind down, as I start to wind down, and hopefully move this into a much larger conversation than just one with myself. How do we move away from this? Because now we have thousands of people who waited in line for hours on April 11th to receive food from the food bank, because they're so close to a line where they're afraid they won't be able to feed their families, and are forced to do this. This is our inequality. We got here largely from how our city was built and for whom. And so we need to keep asking ourselves, as we continue to build our city, for whom, right? Who gets to accumulate? Right? And so when I changed my title, I hope now that you can understand why, because the geography is really baked into the inequality. I can't just map it. I need to understand how they're related. And so now we talked about what we hope for and what we mourn for. And I do like deeply believe that there's two questions that we have to answer. We have to, as a community, be willing to ask and to answer. And one of them is, how did we get here? And the other one is, what are we going to do about it? But we can't ignore one or the other. I think that, again, academics, people who study, tend to ignore the what do we do about it. And those who work and those who are activists and sometimes tend to ignore, how did we get here? And we need to have conversations like this one. So I'm going to take this away and revisit. And thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Dacre.
Wow, thank you, Christine. That was really incredible just to see all of the maps. We had what we're going to do right now is we're actually going to open it up for question and answers. And a couple of folks dropped some questions in the chat box. One of the questions actually came from Francis Gonzalez. And Francis, you're more than welcome to show your camera and ask the question, or I can even ask it for you. And if you'd like to comment, you can. But the question was, how do cities address some of these inequalities? And I believe Frances has actually been in San Antonio her entire life and might
Just about
have some additional questions, but that's a great one.
Yeah, actually, she's the best person in town to answer that question. But I'll start it because I can do it from kind of a generalized perspective, and she knows all the nitty gritty. From a really generalized perspective, there's kind of two kind of buckets, or whatever that word would be, of thought about a question like that one. Is like, how do we proceed, right? How do we proceed with what we would call community economic development? There's place-based community economic development, that we invest in places, right? We invest in infrastructure, we invest in places, and then that will kind of raise all boats, right? And then there's what's called people focused or people-based community economic development, is that we actually need to invest in individuals and human capital, right? In individual people, so that they can begin this wealth accumulation process and then make decisions for themselves about where they want to live. In all honesty, the track record from across the United States, from big cities across the United States, is that place-based community economic development policies are leading to gentrification. There may be a few years in the process that they truly do become integrated kind of middle income neighborhoods, but that's just on the process towards gentrification. Without proper protections in place so that people can remain in their own homes, as home values go up with some of these investments, we see people losing them. People-based community economic development, right? And this is on the ballot. And I'm not going to get political with anybody. I promise I won't, but it is on the ballot right now. Now, do we invest in people in terms of education, in terms of workforce development, in terms of giving them like some of the, if we're not going to do reparations, which should probably still be on the table as a talking point here and as something and as a strategy. But if we're not going to have that conversation, then we need to have a conversation in investing in human beings, and so that they can accumulate the human capital that's necessary to turn it into wealth. And I would love to hear what Frances has to say now or later.
Yeah, that's great. Frances, did you have anything to add to that? I have a question from someone, but Frances, I'd love to give you a chance to chime in if you'd like.
So I appreciate the conciseness of the answer. I mean, this is such a hard question, and I knew it when you gave us the opportunity to participate in the questions and answers. But listen, I think that San Antonio's tried both, and I think we have been somewhat successful. But it's a scary thing what's happening with respect to gentrification in San Antonio. And we're losing affordable housing units every day, every second. And COVID, unfortunately, let us know very drastically and brutally that we need to invest in people more every day. So I'm just gonna leave it there because you have some fantastic questions in the chat.
Thank you, Frances. I want to turn this over to Mr. Booker. He had a specific question about school districts in San Antonio. Are you there, Mr. Booker?
I am.
Awesome.
I have a question about the school districts.
Yeah.
I'm actually doing research on a school district in San Antonio. So I want to know why there are 17 different school districts in San Antonio. My feeling is it's about race, but I just wanted to hear what you
totally. That is the question, right? And that's where I started. I started in the same place because I was trying to get kids in school and like, what is with all of these school districts? Because I'm not from a place like that. And I did a lot of work on that to try to figure out why they're there and why they're so different. We started with 68. Until the 1950s, we had about 68 different school districts. They consolidated to form the present day 18, but they consolidated as a function of property values, right? So, and property values are a function of all of those racial restrictions and that redlining. So really, again, encoded right into school district boundaries are some of this racist past. And some, it's a racialized wealth income past also, right? And the school districts, they work with what they've got, they struggle with what they've got, and there's a push to consolidate. But my experience with the school districts is that it's at the individual school that a difference is made in the child's life. So yes, maybe consolidate, but can we like shift the focus down to the very, very local level where those teachers and those principals know those kids and can give them the very best services that they deserve in a particular neighborhood. But you're right, as far as the districts, my the work that I've done and I spent a couple years on it, really showed in the old school board minutes that this was all about property values.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. Thank you for asking that. It's funny we're talking about school districts because Becky said she was a teacher at Edgewood ISD, and she understood that all the land that wasn't taxable for the school district. So she wanted us to talk a little bit about the inequality of school finance and property tax and what that looks like.
Yeah, and let me just say one word about that, because I honestly think we shot ourselves in the foot last year when we voted against a statewide income tax, and so we're over reliant on property taxes. And up until the Robin Hood Act, the school districts were almost solely responsible or solely reliant on property value. And the districts themselves were a function of that value. But that's one of these problems with when we adopt Robin Hood and insist that we've got equal spending across every student. We're starting with inequality though. So we just maintained the inequality when we did that. Instead, we have to redistribute that money and really funnel it into the areas that had been really kind of sucked dry for 100 years. We need to bring the money back.
Yes, that's really, really great. Thank you for answering that. I know that Sonia really had a question about data on minorities. She said, Sonia, you're there. You're more than welcome to, if you want to put your camera on, ask the question. I think you'll do such a better job than I would. So Sonia, why don't you just go ahead and ask your question to Christine?
Sure. My question to Christine was, she talked about some of those gentrified areas, but I think over time as well, I guess I'm asking for what's the data on minorities who've made it out of poverty by way of education, getting a good career, now they're building wealth, and now they're going back into those gentrified areas to reinvest in housing there. So do you have any data on that, and is that considered hurting gentrification, or that's just considered some of us finally made it and we want to go back and invest in those houses that were previously not available to our generational family?
No, and the risk of gentrification is displacement, in all honesty, because as some of these areas gentrify, we've been losing the affordable housing stock, both through demolition and through repurposing. So there's a lot to celebrate about gentrification. We can't do it at the risk of some of the lowest income families, because we need to protect people, and as those of us who are able to accumulate wealth and invest wealth, we can't do it at the sake of others, right? So how can we do both? How can we maintain the affordable housing like Dignity neighborhood? You know, if we look at that, it used to have elite, it had, you know, that middle-class neighborhood that I point to behind the elite housing, but it also had the integrated lower income working class housing along the railroad tracks. As it's gentrified, that's the part we've lost, right? And so can we find a way to maintain that, to maintain some of the affordability as we reinvest? So far, we're not doing so good, in all honesty. We are reinvesting, but at the sake of lower income families. And so can we do both? And that's going to take a lot of really looking hard at the real estate industry. And a lot of this, unfortunately, lies at the level of the state, but we have to understand things like appraisals, right? Why does somebody's income tax go up, or somebody's property tax go up? Because, you know, like Ms. Canales is invested in a house a couple blocks away, but in fact it does, right? And that family then, not through any of the actions of one person, but they may lose that house because of rising property taxes. So yes, we need to invest. Yes, the city needs us to invest. But we can't do it at the sake of families being displaced, and we got to figure it out.
That's really, thank you, Christine. Roberts, are you there? I think he had a really great question about census data. Robert, would you like to ask a question? I saw a question in the chat box from you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. So for a long time, I've always believed just census in general help with kind of keeping things segregated in a way. And so this is also just a kind of assumption, but do the census help based off of, because they take in education levels, income levels of households, races, and all of that kind of stuff? Would that be something that kind of helps keep things segregated in a sense based off of where businesses build their businesses or invest in the community, and or with schools and just redlining and all of that's kind of wonderful stuff that we deal with?
Yeah, interesting. And I use census in particular, I don't know, we use the census, so reliant on it. But I think that the question here also almost could be extended to just include data, right? Because when businesses are thinking about going in, they're looking at census, but they're also looking at the spending capacity of a neighborhood. So that's, like, where are people spending their money? They're looking at credit card swipes. They're looking at kind of spending patterns in a particular neighborhood to try to figure out if they're going to make it there. So how does data in general feed back into this? Man, interesting question that I haven't given a lot of thought to it, and I am a pretty heavy data user. The schools use census data in order to kind of respond to who's there. But I guess the question is, does it feed back? And it must. I know when I bought a house, I was looking at census data and trying to figure out who lives where and what different neighborhoods were like. So I was using it and sorting myself in that process. But we need data. There's too many just kind of ideological arguments out there about what cities look like, and they're not data driven. They're more driven on politics. And historically, we have made a lot of decisions based on politics and not on data. So even if it's flawed, even if it might be part of the problem, I think that I would come down on still having a data-driven argument rather than a political or an ideological one, because our track record again is that promises through the political process. But without data, we haven't been able to make change, or the change that we really want to. So I'm sorry if that's not like an in-depth enough answer, but it's almost like an ontological question that will require a lot more thought. So please stay in touch.
Yeah, that's a good one. That was a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to. Thank you so much for asking that one, and continue to drop. I mean, guys, folks are asking some really great questions in the chat box, so continue to do that. We want to come back to this people-based economic development idea. I know that Patton dropped an article in the chat about a project and that really gives examples of cash grants to families, but are there other examples? Like, what does people-based economic development look like, and how can we support it?
Is that to me?
Yes, that's to you.
People-based, meaning like, let's invest in people, right? Invest in human capital, with the thinking that if we can raise up people's ability to participate in the economy, and then to begin that wealth accumulation process that we need so that we avoid the food bank lines. Certain sectors of the population have historically been denied some of those, the education opportunities, the asset opportunities. And then with the economic changes that really have gone into effect within my lifetime, so people between their, from 40 on up, may have been trained for an to participate in an industrial economy, and now we're not in an industrial economy. Our jobs are in a post-industrial or a service-based economy. And those are very, very different, right? And they need a very different kind of training. So a lot of us, and I know it's a story in my own family, right? My uncles were part of this, got laid off, and then, you know, came out into the 1970s, 1980s without the ability to participate. A service-based economy has just a couple of kinds of jobs: low-paying jobs, taking care of others, and very high-paying jobs for people who are extremely well educated. And so for those not in one of those two brackets, they struggle. And this is where some more people-based community economic development can really make a difference, on education, on workforce development, on workforce training, and so that then people can participate.
That's great. Thank you. I think some examples that I saw in the chat box were the Alamo Promise Fund.
Yes, Alamo Promise and Pre-K for Us are the two fantastic examples of this. Yes.
And Lift Fund. Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep, exactly.
So Cynthia, before we come to a close, one of the things that Cynthia said was that she's learned that some families are moving back.
Mhm.
Cynthia, are you on? What are some, can you elaborate a little bit on what you said in the chat box about families moving back, but not?
Sure. You know, what I learned and through different you know, presentations that I've been hearing is, you know, say an individual, two individuals went to the same Ivy League school, and one family may have been able to have the resources to send their kid to college and walk out with zero debt.
Mhm.
Another family sends their child, they get the same grades, they get everything identical, but when they go to buy a house, they want to go back into or live into a certain neighborhood, they buy the same house. Well, those two individuals are going to get two different interest rates, because one individual is going to have little debt, the other one's going to have a lot of debt. So they're paying two different prices for that same identical neighborhood. That was what just really was just crazy for me to think about. They're going in, same education, same everything, but they're paying two different, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in difference in interest rates for the same house.
Wow.
Awesome example. Mhm.
That's such a great example.
Yep. And how did the one go debt free? Probably, I mean, it may be inheritance or whatever, right? But probably, if it's the American story, their parents took out equity on that house, right? Because the house had increased in value. And then we start to generate equity, we can borrow against it. But if you don't have that in your family, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're going to do is we're coming to an end. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. Christine, I just want to thank you for hopping on and sharing your knowledge with us. And to Sonia and Roberts and Cynthia and Mr. Booker and all the folks that asked questions. You asked really great questions, and we'd like to continue to have this conversation with you. And we want you to continue to engage with us, because we all care about this city, right? And many of us are very, very upset about what's happened, and we want to figure out what we can do, right, to become more equitable as San Antonio. So what we want to do is a couple things. Is one is that we ask that you continue to learn and journey with us. We're including a link to our learning library, which is something that we have for you to read, watch, and listen to. We also have a quick survey, because your feedback is very, very important to us. And we want to continue that we're crafting experiences that we're all learning from and learning together. The other thing is that we have another event coming up, and we would like to encourage you to register. It is a SA Hills immersion. It's actually going to be on the east side of San Antonio. So this is a perfect segue if you wanted to see some of the streets of San Antonio on the east side. That's going to be happening. That will be November 18th. We encourage you to register, because we do have a small limited capacity with COVID-19 restrictions and protocols. And so we're going to be socially distanced and safe, but it's also going to be very limited capacity. So we want to encourage you to register for that, again, November 18th. You should have the link. So we just want to thank everyone for joining us. Some people asked if we have recorded this and that they would like to share that. Definitely know that we will be in contact with you to share today's recording with you. And we look forward to continuing to have conversations with you. And thank you again so much, Christine. We really appreciate your time, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.